Clara Bennett pressed the barrel of her late husband's Colt Navy against the Apache warrior's forehead and tried to find the courage to pull the trigger. He lay bleeding in her barn, his dark eyes staring up at her with a mixture of pain and resignation, waiting for the death he knew he deserved. 3 families had been massacred just miles from her homestead. The Hendricks children, 8 and 10 years old, had been found scalped and mutilated. Every rational thought in Clara's head screamed that this man might have been there, might have participated in the slaughter. But his lips moved in a whisper so broken it shattered her certainty. "Please, help me." Clara's finger trembled on the trigger. At 29, 3 years widowed and alone on this harsh frontier, she'd learned that mercy was a luxury that could get you killed. Apache warriors showed no mercy to settler families. Why should she show any to him? The smart choice was obvious. Pull the trigger. Drag his body outside for the cavalry patrol to find. Collect the bounty money. Be the hero who'd killed one of the raiders. Instead, Clara Bennett made the choice that would either save them both or doom them all. She lowered the gun. "You're hurt," she said, her voice barely steadier than his whisper. "Let me see." The Apache warrior's eyes widened with shock, the same shock that coursed through Clara's own veins. She was violating every rule of frontier survival, every lesson learned from 3 years of living in constant fear of Indian raids. But as she knelt beside him, seeing the cavalry saber wound that had nearly killed him and the pain that made him human, Clara realized she was crossing a line that would change everything. The war outside her barn would soon come looking for this man. When it did, she would have to choose between her neighbor's trust and her own conscience, between the safety of hatred and the danger of mercy. She just hoped they'd both live long enough to discover which choice had been right. The barn door hung askew, splintered by what looked like gunfire. Inside, the sweet smell of hay was overwhelmed by the metallic stench of blood. Near the far corner, behind a pile of feed sacks, a figure lay crumpled against the wooden wall, buckskin shirt torn and soaked crimson, long black hair matted with dirt and worse. An Apache brave, barely breathing, a cavalry saber wound gaping across his ribs. His eyes flickered open as Clara approached, and she saw something that stopped her cold, not the fierce hatred she'd expected, but desperate, human fear. This wasn't a warrior anymore, just a broken man who knew he was about to die. "Please," he whispered in broken English, blood frothing at his lips. "Help me." Clara stared down at him, her fingers still on the trigger of her husband's gun. 3 years of frontier warnings echoed in her mind. Never trust an Apache. They'll scalp you soon as look at you. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. But all she saw was pain and pleading eyes that looked terrifyingly human. The choice she made next would shatter her quiet life forever. Clara's hands shook as she set down the gun and reached for her medicine bag. The Apache brave's eyes widened with surprise, and something that might have been hope. "This is insane," she muttered to herself, but her hands were already working, cutting away the bloodied buckskin to reveal the extent of his wounds. The saber cut was deep but clean, and there was a bullet crease along his left arm that was bleeding freely but not life-threatening. As she worked by lantern light, cleaning the wounds with whiskey that made the brave bite back screams, Clara noticed details that chilled her more than the October wind. The intricate beadwork on his medicine pouch wasn't just beautiful, it was the mark of high rank. The Thunderbird design worked in turquoise and silver was something she'd heard Army scouts describe with a mixture of respect and fear. This wasn't just any Apache warrior. This was someone important. Gray Wolf, he managed between gritted teeth, seeming to read her thoughts. Son of Standing Bear. Clara's blood turned to ice water. Chief Standing Bear, the Apache leader whose war party had been terrorizing settlements across the territory for 2 years. The man whose son now lay bleeding in her barn was personally responsible for the deaths of dozens of settlers. And she was saving his life. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why were you here? Are there others?" Gray Wolf's eyes struggled to focus on her face. "Scouting, cavalry patrol. Walked into ambush. My brothers, all dead." His voice broke on the last words, and Clara saw tears mixing with the blood on his cheeks. The sound of distant hoofbeats made them both freeze. Clara blew out the lantern and pressed herself against the barn wall, listening. The horses were coming closer, but from the wrong direction to be Apache. The measured cadence suggested cavalry. "They're looking for survivors," she whispered. If they find you here. Grey Wolf tried to push himself upright, fresh blood seeping through the bandages Clara had just applied. Leave me. Save yourself. Instead, Clara made a decision that surprised them both. She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as they stumbled across the yard toward her cabin. There's a root cellar under the kitchen. Can you make it? The hoofbeats were getting closer. Through the pre-dawn darkness, Clara could see torches bobbing along the trail that led to her homestead. Maybe 10 minutes before they arrived, she half-carried Grey Wolf down the narrow steps into the root cellar, a space barely large enough for preserves and winter vegetables. As she settled him onto a pile of old blankets, his hand caught her wrist. Why? He asked, echoing her earlier question. Clara looked into his eyes, no longer fierce with war paint and rage, but human and grateful and achingly young. Because someone has to break this cycle, she said simply. Above them, the cavalry patrol was pounding on her front door. Mrs. Bennet, open up. This is Lieutenant Morrison, 3rd Cavalry. Clara climbed the cellar steps on trembling legs, her mind racing. She'd hidden the bloodied bandages and cleaned her hands, but the smell of gunpowder and fear still hung in the air like smoke. She opened the door to find 6 mounted troopers, their uniforms dusty from hard riding and their faces grim with the aftermath of battle. Lieutenant Morrison dismounted, his eyes scanning her cabin for signs of trouble. Ma'am, we've been tracking Apache raiders. Trail led right past your property. Have you seen anything suspicious tonight? Clara's throat felt like sandpaper, but she kept her voice steady. I heard shooting earlier. Scared me something fierce. Is everyone all right? We lost 3 men at the patrol station, Morrison said, his jaw tight with anger. Whole war party just vanished afterward, like ghosts. But we found blood trail leading this direction. One of the soldiers had dismounted and was examining the ground near her barn with a torch. Lieutenant, fresh blood here, and it's Apache. Clara's heart hammered so hard she was sure they could hear it. There were arrows, she said quickly. 2 of them hit my cabin. Maybe one of them was wounded when they attacked you. Morrison's eyes sharpened with interest. Show me. Clara led them to the doorframe where the arrow still protruded, and to the shattered window. The physical evidence supported her story, but Morrison's eyes were too intelligent, too experienced. Mind if we search the property, ma'am? Standard procedure after an attack. Of course, Clara replied, praying her voice didn't betray her. Though I don't know what you'd find. I've been hiding in the cabin since the shooting started. The soldiers spread out, checking the barn, the well, the small shed where Clara kept her tools. Every second felt like an hour. Below her feet, Grey Wolf lay unconscious, or maybe pretending to be, in a space so small that one wrong footstep might reveal the trapdoor. Lieutenant Morrison returned from the barn, his face thoughtful. Lot of blood in there. More than you'd expect from a wounded raider passing through. Clara forced herself to meet his eyes. Like I said, Lieutenant, I was too scared to investigate. Maybe he was hurt worse than I thought. A long moment passed in silence. Then Morrison nodded slowly. We'll post a guard tonight, just to be safe. Can't have Apache raiders coming back to finish what they started. As the patrol prepared to make camp near her property, Clara realized with growing horror that her problems were just beginning. How could she tend to Grey Wolf's wounds with cavalry troopers watching her every move? How long could she keep this secret with armed men literally outside her door? But as she glanced toward the barely visible outline of the cellar entrance, she knew there was no turning back. She'd made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences, even if it killed them both. For 3 days, Clara lived with the knowledge that one wrong step could expose everything. The cavalry patrol had made camp 50 yards from her cabin, close enough that she could hear the soldiers talking around their campfire every night. Lieutenant Morrison was thorough and suspicious, exactly the kind of officer who didn't miss details. During the day, Clara maintained a careful routine. She tended her garden, fed her chickens, and made small talk with the soldiers who came to her well for water. But every time she entered her cabin, her heart raced with the knowledge of who lay hidden beneath her kitchen floor. She'd managed to get water and food to Grey Wolf only twice, during the brief periods when all the soldiers were away from camp. Each time, she found him weaker but alert, his dark eyes holding a mixture of gratitude and guilt that cut her to the bone. You should have let me die, he whispered during her second visit, his voice barely audible even in the cramped cellar. This will bring death to your door. Maybe, Clara replied, checking his bandages by candlelight. But letting you die would have brought death to my soul. On the fourth morning, everything changed. Clara was hanging laundry when she noticed smoke rising from the direction of town. Too much smoke, too black, rising in columns that spoke of buildings burning. Within minutes, a rider appeared on the horizon, galloping hard toward the cavalry camp. The message the rider brought sent the soldiers into immediate action. Apache war parties had hit 3 settlements simultaneously during the night. The patrol was being recalled to join a major offensive. Lieutenant Morrison approached Clara's cabin as his men broke camp, his face grave with the weight of command decisions. "Mrs. Bennett, I'm posting 2 men here to guard your property while we're gone. Can't leave civilians unprotected with Standing Bear's warriors running wild." Clara's blood turned to ice. 2 soldiers staying behind meant constant surveillance. No chance to tend to Gray Wolf. No way to keep him alive until the patrol returned. "That's very kind, Lieutenant, but unnecessary," she managed. "I've been taking care of myself for 3 years now." Morrison shook his head. "Not negotiable, ma'am. Corporals Jenkins and Walsh will be staying. They have orders to shoot any Apache on sight." He paused, his eyes studying her face. "That blood trail from your barn still bothers me. If there's anything you haven't told me." "There's nothing," Clara said firmly, meeting his gaze despite the fear clawing at her chest. After the patrol rode out, Corporals Jenkins and Walsh made themselves comfortable on Clara's front porch, their rifles within easy reach and their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Jenkins was young and talkative, eager to share stories of Indian fighting. Walsh was older, quieter, with the kind of suspicious nature that came from too many years on the frontier. That night, as Clara lay in her bed listening to the soldiers' quiet conversation outside, she realized she faced an impossible choice. Gray Wolf hadn't had water in over 12 hours, and his wounds needed fresh dressing. Without treatment, he would die within days. But attempting to help him meant risking not just her own life, but the lives of 2 young soldiers who were only trying to protect her. In the darkness of her cabin, Clara Bennett prepared to make the most dangerous gamble of her life. Clara waited until the deepest part of the night, when even the crickets had gone quiet, and the only sound was Walsh's soft snoring from the porch. Jenkins was supposed to be on watch, but she could see through her window that his head was nodding, exhaustion finally overtaking duty. She moved like a ghost through her own home, avoiding the floorboards she knew would creak, carrying a small flask of water and strips of clean cloth. The cellar entrance was directly below where Jenkins sat, separated only by thin wooden planks and her desperate hope that his fatigue would keep him asleep. She lifted the trapdoor with painstaking care, lowering herself into the darkness below. Gray Wolf was conscious but burning with fever, his breathing shallow and labored. In the dim light of a candle stub, Clara could see that his wounds were infected. "You're dying," she whispered, her hands already working to clean the worst of the inflammation. "Good," he replied weakly. "This charade has gone on too long. Let me die with honor." "There's no honor in dying from infected wounds," Clara shot back, surprised by the fierceness in her own voice. "If you're going to die, at least die fighting for something worth fighting for." Gray Wolf's eyes focused on her face with difficulty. "What do you want me to fight for?" "Peace," Clara said simply. "Your father's war parties are hitting settlements across the territory. Good people are dying on both sides. Maybe it's time someone tried a different way." Before Gray Wolf could respond, they both heard footsteps above, heavy boots pacing across the porch. Jenkins was awake and moving around. Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. If Jenkins decided to come inside for coffee or just to warm up, he might notice the barely concealed cellar entrance. Above them, Jenkins's voice carried clearly through the floorboards. "Walsh, wake up. Thought I heard something." Clara blew out the candle, plunging them into absolute darkness. Gray Wolf's hand found hers in the blackness, squeezing gently, a gesture of reassurance from the man she was trying to save. "Probably just mice," Walsh's voice replied, thick with sleep. "This old cabin's full of them." "Maybe. I'm going to check around back anyway." The footsteps moved off the porch, circling the cabin. Clara pressed her eye to a gap in the foundation stones, watching Jenkins's lantern light play across her vegetable garden and the small shed where she kept her tools. Then Jenkins stopped directly above the cellar, his boots visible through the gap between floorboards. Clara held her breath, Grey Wolf motionless beside her, both of them frozen in absolute terror. Jenkins stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then his boots moved away, and they heard him return to the porch. "Nothing," he told Walsh. "Just spooked myself, I guess." In the darkness below, Clara finished treating Grey Wolf's wounds with hands that shook from more than fear. She was no longer just hiding an enemy warrior. She was harboring hope itself, the fragile possibility that two peoples locked in endless war might find another way. But as she climbed back up to her cabin, leaving Grey Wolf in his underground sanctuary, Clara wondered how long that hope could survive in a world determined to destroy it. Outside, Jenkins had resumed his watch, more alert now, his rifle ready across his knees. The window for Secret Mercy was closing fast, and Clara didn't know if she could keep them both alive until it opened again. The crisis came 5 days later, just as Grey Wolf's fever finally broke and Clara dared to hope he might survive. A dust cloud on the horizon announced riders approaching fast, not cavalry this time, but a ragged group of settlers, their faces hard with grief and fury. Clara recognized most of them. Jake Morrison from the blacksmith shop, Tom Bradley the sheriff, Sarah Mitchell the preacher's wife, and a dozen others from Cedar Ridge. They rode into her yard like an army of vengeance, surrounding the cabin before Clara could even step outside. Corporals Jenkins and Walsh came off the porch with rifles ready, but they were badly outnumbered. Jake Morrison dismounted, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. In his massive hands, he held something that made Clara's blood turn to ice. Grey Wolf's war lance, its distinctive eagle feathers and brass ornaments unmistakable. "Found this half a mile from the Hendricks place," Morrison announced, his voice carrying to everyone present. "Whole family's dead, Clara. Pa, Ma, and both kids. Scalped and butchered like animals." Clara's throat went dry. "Jake, I'm sorry, but I don't understand why you're here." "Blood trail led right past your property," Sheriff Bradley cut in, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Same as before. Funny how Apache sign keeps showing up around your homestead." The crowd of settlers murmured angrily, their horses shifting restlessly as tension built like electricity before a storm. Clara could see the dangerous mood in their eyes. These were people pushed beyond their breaking point, looking for someone to blame. Corporal Jenkins stepped forward, trying to maintain order. "Now, folks, Mrs. Bennett's been under our protection. She couldn't be harboring hostiles with us right here, could she?" Walsh added, but his voice carried doubt, and Clara saw him studying her face with new suspicion. Morrison held up the war lance, its eagle feathers fluttering in the wind. "This belongs to Grey Wolf, Standing Bear's son, the same warrior whose blood trail we've been following. Now either that Apache's been dancing around this homestead like it's his personal hunting ground, or—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Sarah Mitchell urged her horse forward, her usually gentle face hard with loss. "Clara, the Hendricks children were 8 and 10 years old. Little Mary was clutching her doll when we found her. If you know something about who did this—" "I don't," Clara said, but her voice cracked on the words, and she saw several people in the crowd exchange meaningful glances. Sheriff Bradley dismounted, his movements deliberate and official. "Clara Bennett, I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of harboring enemy combatants. We're going to search this property from top to bottom." The crowd cheered, their bloodlust finally finding a target. Clara felt the walls of her secret world collapsing around her as armed men spread out to search every building, every hiding place, including the root cellar beneath her kitchen floor. In minutes, maybe seconds, they would find Grey Wolf. The man she'd saved would be dragged out and killed, probably tortured first for information about other Apache positions. And Clara herself would likely face a hangman's rope for treason. But as she watched the settlers swarm toward her cabin, Clara made one final, desperate choice. "Wait," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "There's something you need to know." The crowd turned toward her, their faces eager for confession, for confirmation of their suspicions. Clara took a deep breath and stepped toward the greatest gamble of her life. "You're right. Grey Wolf is here. And before you kill him, before you kill me, there's something he wants to tell you about who really murdered the Hendricks family." The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. The crowd erupted in shouts of fury and vindication, rifles swinging toward Clara as the full weight of her confession hit home. But Sheriff Bradley raised his hand for silence, his lawman's instincts overriding the mob's bloodlust. "What did you say about the Hendricks murders?" he demanded. Clara's legs felt like water, but she forced herself to stand straight. "Grey Wolf has been here for over a week, barely conscious with infected wounds. He couldn't have killed anyone, but he might know who did." "Lying Apache witch," someone shouted from the crowd, but Bradley's sharp gesture cut off further outbursts. "Bring him out," the sheriff ordered. Now, Clara led the way to her cabin, the armed crowd following like wolves scenting blood. Corporals Jenkins and Walsh looked stunned, realizing they'd been stationed guard duty over the very fugitive they were supposed to be hunting. Clara knelt by the kitchen floor and lifted the trapdoor, revealing the cramped cellar beneath. "Grey Wolf," she called softly. "It's time." The Apache warrior emerged slowly, weak but dignified, his dark eyes taking in the hostile crowd without flinching. Even wounded and outnumbered, he carried himself with the bearing of a chief's son. Jake Morrison raised his rifle, finger on the trigger. "Give me one reason not to shoot this murdering savage right now." "Because," Grey Wolf said in clear, careful English, "the men who killed your families are not Apache." The crowd froze, confusion replacing certainty on their faces. Grey Wolf continued, his voice growing stronger. "3 days ago, I heard riders pass near this place. White men, but dressed as Apache, painted for war. They spoke of raids that would blame my people, bring soldiers to hunt us while they escape with stolen horses and gold." "You're lying," Morrison snarled, but doubt flickered in his eyes. "The Hendricks place," Grey Wolf said quietly. "Were the bodies arranged? Scalped in a way that seemed too perfect, too much like what white men think Apache do." Sheriff Bradley's face went pale. "How could you know that unless—" "Because real Apache don't take trophies that way. Because whoever killed your people wanted you to find evidence that would lead you to blame Standing Bear's tribe." Sarah Mitchell pushed forward, her face streaked with tears. "If what you're saying is true, then who? Who would do such a thing?" Grey Wolf met her eyes with something like compassion. "Men who profit from war, who sell guns to both sides, who take land when people flee in terror. Men who need Apache to remain your enemies so their business continues." The crowd was silent now, the terrible logic of his words sinking in. Clara watched as certainty crumbled into doubt, as bloodlust gave way to the more complex challenge of seeking actual justice. Sheriff Bradley holstered his weapon. "Names," he demanded. "If you're telling the truth, give us names." Grey Wolf nodded slowly. "Edgar Thornton and his men. The railroad agent from Tucson. I have watched them for weeks, gathering information for my father. They have been selling weapons to renegade Apache while reporting false raids to bring more soldiers, more conflict, more profit." The name hit the crowd like a physical blow. Thornton was a respected businessman, a pillar of the territorial community. But Clara saw recognition dawning on several faces. Men who'd had dealings with the railroad agent, who'd noticed his sudden wealth, his convenient absences during Apache attacks. "This is still just the word of a savage," Morrison protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then search Thornton's warehouse," Grey Wolf replied calmly. "Look for Apache weapons that were never taken in battle, scalps that were cut by steel knives instead of stone blades. Evidence of the lies he has been selling." Sheriff Bradley looked around at the crowd, seeing the same doubt and dawning understanding in their faces that Clara felt in her own heart. "We ride to Tucson," he announced. "Tonight. If this warrior is lying, we'll know soon enough. If he's telling the truth." He didn't finish the sentence, but Clara could see the implications playing out in everyone's minds. If Grey Wolf was right, then they'd been manipulated into nearly lynching an innocent woman and her wounded patient while the Real killers escaped justice. As the crowd dispersed to prepare for the ride to Tucson, Clara found herself alone with Grey Wolf for the first time since the crisis began. He slumped against her cabin wall, exhausted by the ordeal but alive. "Was it true?" she asked quietly. "About Thornton." Grey Wolf's eyes met hers, and she saw a flicker of something that might have been a smile. Some of it. Enough to make them look for the real truth instead of the convenient lie. "And the rest?" "The rest," he said softly, "is what peace looks like, Clara Bennett. People choosing to seek justice instead of revenge, truth instead of hatred. You have given me more than my life. You have given me hope that this war can end. Outside, the sound of horses and shouting voices filled the night as the search party prepared to ride. Clara didn't know what they would find in Tucson, but she knew that everything had changed. The woman who had once lived quietly on the edge of the frontier was now at the center of something much larger. A chance for two peoples to find a different way forward, built on the fragile foundation of trust that had begun in her root cellar. Whether that trust would survive what came next remained to be seen. The search party returned from Tucson 3 days later, their faces grim with the weight of terrible discoveries. Sheriff Bradley dismounted in Clara's yard, holding a leather satchel that clinked with the sound of metal objects. "Found scalps in Thornton's warehouse," he announced to the assembled crowd. "White scalps, Indian scalps, some so old they'd been treated with chemicals to preserve them." Man had been collecting trophies for years, staging raids, selling fear along with his railroad contracts. The crowd that had come to lynch Clara and Gray Wolf now stood in stunned silence. Jake Morrison's massive hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. The Hendricks family. Killed by Thornton's men, dressed as Apache, Bradley confirmed. "We found the war paint, the fake weapons, even clothing taken from real Apache dead. Thornton broke down and confessed when we showed him the evidence." Sarah Mitchell sank onto Clara's porch steps, her face pale with shock. All these years, all this hatred, and we were being played for fools. Gray Wolf emerged from the cabin, moving slowly but under his own power. His wounds had healed enough that he no longer needed constant care, but Clara noticed he stayed close to the building, ready to take cover if the crowd's mood shifted again. "Where does this leave us?" Morrison asked, his voice subdued. "Thornton's in custody, but Standing Bear's still out there with his war parties. How do we know this changes anything?" It was Gray Wolf who answered, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "My father fights because he believes all white men are like Thornton, men who see Apache only as obstacles to be removed. If I return to him with proof that some white people can choose justice over revenge, perhaps he will listen to talk of peace." "And if he doesn't?" Corporal Jenkins asked. He and Walsh had remained at Clara's homestead throughout the crisis, their orders unchanged even as everything else shifted around them. "Then at least we tried," Clara said, stepping beside Gray Wolf in a gesture of solidarity that wasn't lost on anyone present. "At least we chose to see each other as human beings instead of enemies." The crowd stirred uneasily, old prejudices warring with new understanding. These were people who had lost friends and family to Apache raids, who had been raised to see Indians as savage threats to civilization. Changing those beliefs wouldn't happen overnight. But Sheriff Bradley nodded slowly. "Mrs. Bennett's right. We've been dancing to Thornton's tune for too long, letting fear and hatred make our decisions for us." He looked directly at Gray Wolf. "You have my word. Safe passage back to your people, and time to deliver your message before any military action resumes." "More than time," Sarah Mitchell said, rising from the porch steps with new determination. "I'll write letters to the territorial governor, to Washington if necessary. People need to know what really happened here, how close we came to perpetuating an injustice." One by one, others in the crowd began to nod agreement. Not all of them. Clara could see skepticism and lingering hostility on several faces. But enough to matter, enough to make a difference. As the crowd began to disperse, planning their next steps and discussing the implications of what they'd learned, Clara found herself alone with Gray Wolf once more. "Will your father listen to you?" she asked. Gray Wolf was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes scanning the horizon where his people's territory began. "Standing Bear is a proud man, made hard by years of war. But he is also wise, and he grieves for the young men we have lost. If I can show him another path, one that doesn't require surrender or defeat, just peace," Clara finished. "Peace," Gray Wolf agreed. "The kind that you showed me in your root cellar, when you chose to see a wounded man instead of an enemy warrior." That evening, as Gray Wolf prepared for his journey home, Clara packed supplies for his travels, food, medicine, and a letter she'd written explaining the events of the past weeks. It was addressed to Chief Standing Bear, written in the hope that one father might understand another's grief. "This doesn't guarantee anything," she warned as Gray Wolf secured the supplies to his horse. a gentle mare that Sheriff Bradley had provided for the journey. No, Gray Wolf agreed. But it guarantees the possibility of something. That's more than we had before. As he mounted the horse, he looked down at Clara with an expression of profound gratitude. You saved more than my life, Clara Bennett. You saved my faith in the possibility of peace. Clara watched him ride toward the setting sun, carrying with him the fragile hope that two peoples might find a way to share the same land without destroying each other. She didn't know if Gray Wolf would succeed in convincing his father, or if the territorial authorities would honor their promise of negotiation over warfare. But she knew that something fundamental had changed, both in herself and in the community around her. The cycle of revenge and retaliation that had defined frontier life for so long had been broken, if only temporarily, by the simple choice to show mercy to an enemy. Whether that mercy would grow into lasting peace remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, Clara Bennett dared to hope that it might. 6 months later, Clara's homestead had become something unprecedented on the frontier, a neutral meeting ground where Apache and settlers could gather without fear of violence. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been without setbacks. There had been moments when old hatreds flared, when misunderstandings nearly shattered the fragile peace that Gray Wolf's message had made possible. But each crisis had been met with patient determination from both sides, a commitment to finding solutions rather than excuses for war. Standing Bear himself had come to Clara's homestead twice, a grizzled warrior whose presence commanded respect even from his former enemies. His first visit had been tense, a careful negotiation conducted through translators and filled with suspicious silences. But his second visit, just last week, had included his grandchildren, Apache boys and girls who played games with settler children while their elders discussed water rights and territorial boundaries. Clara stood on her porch now, watching one such group of children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Among them were Billy Henderson, whose parents had been killed in one of Thornton's fake raids, and Little Fox, Gray Wolf's nephew, whose father had died in a cavalry charge 2 years earlier. The boys had bonded over their shared loss and their determination not to let it define their futures. Hard to believe, isn't it? Clara turned to find Gray Wolf approaching, his recovery now complete, and his status transformed from fugitive to diplomat. He spent half his time at the reservation helping his father negotiate with territorial officials, and half here at Clara's homestead, which had become an unofficial embassy for peaceful relations. Sometimes I think I'm dreaming, Clara admitted, that I'll wake up and find you still dying in my root cellar, and none of this will have happened. Gray Wolf smiled, settling onto the porch step beside her. If it's a dream, it's one worth having, worth fighting for. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the children play. In the distance, Clara could see the lights of Cedar Ridge, the town that had initially threatened to lynch them both, but now sent delegations to learn from their example. 3 other frontier communities had established similar neutral grounds, and there was talk of a territorial treaty that would formalize the peace process. Do you ever regret it? Gray Wolf asked, echoing the question Clara had posed to him months earlier. Taking me in that first night? Your life was simpler before. Clara considered the question, watching Little Fox teach Billy how to identify different bird calls in the growing darkness. Simpler, yes, she said finally. But not better. Not fuller. I think we're supposed to help each other, especially when it's hard. Especially when it scares us. Gray Wolf nodded slowly. My grandmother used to say that the Creator puts certain people in our path when we need them most. Perhaps you were meant to find me in your barn. Or perhaps you were meant to find me, Clara replied with a smile. As the evening deepened, bringing with it the promise of another peaceful night, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The root cellar beneath her kitchen floor was now used only for storing vegetables again, but she would never forget the desperate man who had hidden there, or the choice that had changed everything. A rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the last rays of sunlight. Clara tensed momentarily. Old habits from the dangerous months still ran deep, but relaxed when she recognized the familiar figure of Sheriff Bradley. He dismounted with the easy confidence of a man no longer expecting trouble, though Clara noticed he still carried his rifle and kept his eyes alert. The frontier was safer now, but it would never be entirely tame. Evening, Clara, Gray Wolf, Bradley said, touching the brim of his hat. Got some news from the territorial capital you'll want to hear. Gray Wolf stood, his diplomatic instincts sensing importance in the sheriff's manner. Good news or bad? Bradley's weathered face broke into a rare smile. Depends on how you feel about government officials wanting to document what you've accomplished here. Territories sending a representative next month to study your peace process for possible expansion to other regions. Clara felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. Recognition from the territorial government was validation of their work, but it also meant scrutiny, bureaucracy, and the risk that outside interference might disrupt the delicate balance they'd achieved. What kind of study? She asked carefully. The kind that could lead to official policy changes, Bradley replied. The kind that might make what you've done here the model for how we handle conflicts across the whole territory. Governors getting pressure from Washington to find alternatives to the Indian Wars. They're too expensive, and public opinion back east is shifting. Gray Wolf exchanged a meaningful glance with Clara. They both understood the implications. Success would mean their methods could help other communities avoid the cycle of violence that had nearly destroyed this one. Failure under government scrutiny could discredit everything they'd worked for. We'll be ready, Clara said simply. As Sheriff Bradley rode away into the gathering darkness, Clara and Gray Wolf remained on the porch, watching the children gradually drift toward their respective homes. The Apache children would return to the temporary camp their families had established 2 miles away, close enough for daily interaction, but far enough to maintain their traditional ways. The settler children would return to farmsteads and the growing town, carrying with them friendships that crossed cultural boundaries their parents had never imagined possible. Are you nervous? Gray Wolf asked. About the government attention? Clara considered the question. Terrified, she admitted, but also hopeful. If what we've learned here can help other people avoid the pain we've all been through, then the risks are worth taking, Gray Wolf finished. Little Fox ran up to the porch, breathing hard from his games, but grinning widely. In careful English, he said, Aunt Clara, Billy wants to know if you can teach us both how to make that cornbread tomorrow. His mother said Apache and settler boys should learn to cook for themselves. Clara laughed, ruffling the boy's dark hair. Tell Billy I'll teach anyone who wants to learn, as long as they promise to share what they make. As Little Fox ran off to deliver the message, Gray Wolf shook his head in amazement. 6 months ago, that boy was learning war songs. Now he's learning to make cornbread with settler children. Children adapt faster than adults, Clara observed. Maybe that's our real hope, not changing the minds of people set in their ways, but raising a generation that sees cooperation as natural instead of strange. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to another group arriving at the homestead. Clara recognized them as the Weston family, settlers who'd recently arrived from back east and had heard about the peace initiative. Behind them rode 2 hawks, one of Standing Bear's senior warriors, along with his wife and teenage daughter. Both families dismounted with the easy familiarity of people who'd made this journey before. The Westons had been coming to Clara's homestead for 2 weeks now, learning about coexistence from families who'd already made the transition from enemies to neighbors. 2 hawks served as a cultural bridge, helping newcomers understand Apache customs and perspectives. Mrs. Bennett called out James Weston, a former schoolteacher from Ohio whose idealism had brought his family west despite his wife's concerns. We brought the books you requested, the ones about conflict resolution and negotiation techniques. Mary Weston, still visibly nervous around the Apache families despite weeks of interaction, managed a tentative smile as 2 Hawks' daughter approached her own children with a handful of carved wooden toys. Clara watched the careful dance of cultural exchange, remembering her own fear and uncertainty during those first terrifying days when Gray Wolf lay hidden beneath her floor. The progress seemed miraculous now, but she knew it was really just the result of people choosing, again and again, to see past their fears to the humanity on the other side. The evening meal will be ready soon, she announced to the gathered families. Apache stew and settler cornbread seems fitting. As the mixed group settled around the expanded table Clara had built to accommodate these regular gatherings, Gray Wolf took his usual place at her right hand. The seating arrangement had evolved naturally over the months, with Apache and settler families intermingled rather than segregated, children switching languages mid-sentence, and conversations ranging from practical matters like water rights to philosophical discussions about the nature of justice and forgiveness. Tonight's dinner was particularly significant because it included the Hendricks' surviving relatives, James's brother and sister-in-law, who had traveled from Colorado after hearing about the peace process their family's tragedy had inadvertently helped create. Their presence represented a profound act of forgiveness, a choice to honor their loved one's memory through reconciliation rather than revenge. As Clara served the meal she'd prepared with ingredients from both cultures, she reflected on the long journey from that night, when Grey Wolf had whispered his desperate plea for help. The transformation hadn't just been in relationships between Apache and settlers. It had been in her own understanding of what courage really meant. True courage, she'd learned, wasn't the absence of fear. It was the choice to act with compassion despite fear, to risk everything for the possibility of something better. It was Grey Wolf choosing to trust a stranger with his life, Standing Bear choosing to listen to his son's message of peace, and ordinary people choosing to see enemies as potential neighbors. The conversation around the table that night ranged from practical matters, crop rotation techniques that could benefit both cultures, to deeper questions about identity, belonging, and what it meant to share land that both peoples considered home. These discussions weren't always easy or comfortable, but they were honest, and they were happening at all. As the evening wound down and families began preparing for the journey back to their respective homes, Clara felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction that came from hosting these gatherings. The work of peace was every bit as demanding as the work of war, but infinitely more rewarding. Grey Wolf helped her clear the dishes, a domestic routine they developed over the months of cooperation. In the quiet aftermath of the evening's conversations, Clara found herself thinking about the government representative who would arrive next month, the questions he would ask, and the future that hung in the balance. "Do you think we can do it?" she asked Grey Wolf as they worked. "Convince them that this approach works? Make it spread to other places?" Grey Wolf was quiet for a moment, his hands steady as he dried the wooden bowls they'd used for the stew. "I think," he said finally, "that we've already done the hardest part. We've proven it's possible. Everything else is just details." Clara smiled, finding comfort in his confidence. Outside, she could hear the mixed voices of Apache and settler children calling goodbyes to each other, making plans for tomorrow's games, speaking the universal language of friendship that transcended all the boundaries adults tried to impose. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and potential setbacks. But as Clara Bennett stood in her kitchen beside the Apache warrior who had become her closest friend and collaborator, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: unshakable hope for a world where children could grow up seeing diversity as strength rather than threat. The transformation of one small frontier community was complete. Now it was time to find out if that transformation could light the way for others, spreading outward like ripples on a pond until the entire territory, perhaps even the entire frontier, had learned the lesson of Clara's root cellar. That sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is also the most necessary, and that mercy is not weakness but the highest form of strength. In the years that followed, Clara Bennett's homestead would become legendary throughout the American West, not as the site of a famous battle or the location of a gold strike, but as the place where two peoples chose peace over war, understanding over hatred, and hope over fear. The small sanctuary that had begun in a root cellar had grown to encompass an entire way of life, proving that even in the harshest circumstances, the human capacity for compassion could triumph over the human tendency toward conflict. And in the quiet moments of evening, when the work was done and the guests had departed, Clara would sometimes return to that root cellar, remembering the desperate man who had hidden there and the choice that had changed everything. She would think about courage and kindness, about the power of individual actions to reshape the world, and about the simple truth that had guided her from the beginning: that we are all, regardless of our differences, human beings deserving of mercy and capable of grace. The frontier had taught her many lessons about survival, but the most important one had come from the man she'd found bleeding in her barn. That true survival isn't just about staying alive, but about staying human in circumstances that make it easier to become something less. Clara Bennett had chosen to remain human, and in doing so, she had helped others remember their own humanity. It was, perhaps, the greatest victory the frontier had ever seen.